But am I sharing my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint.
Wonderful. Now let's see if I can get rid of this so I can talk about it. Well, a few weeks back, as we adjusted into, I guess, what we're now calling the norm, the women at the Franklin House talked to me about doing a book talk. And I said, well, rather than talk about something I've written or am writing, why don't we talk about something that came up in my last lecture? Years ago, I think, golly, I think in one of my first trips to London as an adult in 2007, I'd never been to the house, but I volunteered to do a talk there because I thought it's a way to, expand the friendships and such. And I try and do that most trips. And as some of you know, I go to London probably more than any American historian has a right to. But usually I do this in person. And as you've heard Caitlin and Eleanor and me saying, we're ready to go to the Ship and Shovel, which is the really cute little pub just around the corner from Benjamin Franklin's front door. That's a building split in half by an alleyway, but we can't do that today. And frankly, I'm not going to have a pint of cider at noon because then I will sleep face down on the floor by supper time. But in the talk that I gave this winter, we talked about texts, and one of the questions that I found really intriguing was, one of the British participants said, Franklin wrote an autobiography, is it available anywhere? And I may have said, joking a bit, it is the most widely read document written by an 18th century person today. It is still in multiple editions. I was actually digging through and trying to find a picture of a good edition to put into this PowerPoint because I was being lazy and didn't want to take pictures and upload them. I have a shelf of Franklin autobiographies at the top of this bookcase behind me that looks in this like it's going to topple over on me, but it won't. But I thought, why don't we talk about it and maybe go through the text? And I know we have an interesting variety of things. We have some people who work as professional historians. We have a bunch of vocational historians, people who put their passion into this, maybe a little later in life. But it's a text that's critically important, I think. And I have to admit, as a very young graduate student, I read Leo LeMay's edition of the autobiography for the first time, and I'm still trying to figure it out. I have to admit, one of my great purchases when you're a poor grad student, as some of you can attest, is buying expensive books, but I bought a copy of the 1964 letterpress edition published by Yale. It is still in print. You can buy this. It's used on Amazon or abebooks.co or .com, and it's very reasonable. It used to be very expensive, but books have gone down in price. But I'm still reading this text and still using it. And the reason in addition to I'm just happy to have a conversation because here I am living in my house very quietly most of the time, I wanted to get a sense of what everybody might do with this. So just to give you a little sense, what are we looking at here? Now, Caitlin, there we go. It is a book written in 4 parts. It's not a book, maybe I should say. It is a collection of paper documents, the originals of which now sit in the Huntington Library in Pasadena, California. I would recommend that you all go there. It's very hard to get in to see it. I was working on a big Franklin project and I was allowed to work with it for 3 hours. And every time I needed to sneeze, cough, take a sip of water, or go to the loo, for those of you in England, you can explain what that is to the rest. Every time this happened, I had to hand it to the librarian who had to step into the vault, hold it against her bosom until I returned, went back through security. And this was 3 hours of my life. In the last few minutes I had it, I walked around the room and said to all the graduate students who were working there with me, this was probably the only time in your life you're going to get to see this. Come see the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. It's a quirk, it's a long story of why it ended up in Pasadena, sold and resold, written in various parts, etc. It's a document that Franklin never finished. It's a document he probably couldn't finish. The man who, according to Yale right now, the published papers of Benjamin Franklin will go to 46 letterpress volumes. 46. That is a massive output. And of course, a lot of his papers were lost over time, a large cache of them during the American War for Independence. Things were scattered. Things are still turning up. Every now and then, we still find an original Franklin primary source. But I want to ask myself some questions and ask you, and I do apologize because for some reason, my Zoom looks fuzzy, as if I'm in an old Joan Crawford movie where she was trying to hide her wrinkles. So I'm not trying to hide my wrinkles. They're very evident, but forgive the fuzziness on this, and at least Benjamin looks better. This is a London portrait of him painted in 1766 and first displayed at the Royal Academy show that year by the amazing portraitist David Martin. This painting has a wonderful history. It was eventually bought by Walter Annenberg, whose publishing company published TV Guide, something we don't have anymore, but it made him into a billionaire, and a whole bunch of other things. And his intention was it would end up in Philadelphia, and it didn't, because Mrs. John F. Kennedy, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, requested it for the White House collection during her famous restoration of the house. And normally it hangs over the green room. However, certain current occupants don't like it and wanted another picture of Benjamin Franklin, so this has been put on loan to the National Portrait Gallery. So I was able to get my nose almost up to it. The security guard came over and told me to back off, and I explained who I was and to take a series of pictures of this. I'm working on a larger project about Franklin portraits that I'll talk about maybe this winter if the ladies invite me back. But this is the Benjamin Franklin. He's 65. I'm sorry, he's 60 here. He is 65 when he starts the autobiography. And he sets to tell the story of his life. To what audience? For what purpose? To what end? I mean, the guy published and published and published and published, and he never, it's clear he had no intention of publishing the autobiography during his life. He was in the grave many years before the first edition came out, translated into French. It was then translated back into English. It was years before the actual manuscript was used to produce an English edition. And that's a long story. Again, you can read about it in Leonard Labourie's edition of the thing. Why did he write it? I'd love to hear people chime in here. Any ideas? Is everyone muted? Oh, you're all muted. Oops, that's why no one's yelling at me. But you know how to unmute yourself if you want to, or Caitlin will do so. But why did he write it? What is the explanation? Oh,
I'll take a stab.
Yes, Anne, please.
You know, sometimes people write because there's a Chinese proverb that says the faintest ink is better than the best memory.
Ooh,
so they write it to get it down on paper so they can remember. If Franklin was 65 when he started writing, in those days that would have been fairly on in a lifespan. So maybe he was concerned about not remembering some of these things, and he wanted to, maybe if they never got published, he would have them for his many descendants. And I'm sure he was a person who, and anybody who's more of a Franklin scholar than I could confirm this, he was a person who had a pretty keen sense of his own importance to the various endeavors that he pursued, and especially diplomacy. So my guess is he wrote it to get it out of his head and on paper for his family and future historians. That's just a guess.
It's a good guess. He was very old. Average life expectancy was mid to late 40s in Philadelphia when he was in his mid to late 40s. He thought he was dying for 40 years. You know, it's almost comical how many times he make reference to, oh, this could be it. No, I'm okay. You know, it's like a Monty Python sketch. And he begins it with an odd thing. First of all, he dates it like it's a letter. They've let me hold the thing, and I apologize. The one picture I forgot to add to here is the picture of me holding the original manuscript. They photographed me, but it's on my new website, gwbphd.com, so you can look at it there. But he begins it as if he's writing a letter, and he writes, "Dear son, I've ever had the pleasure of obtaining any little anecdotes of my ancestors, and you remember the inquiries that I made at the remains of my relations when you were with me in England, and the journey that I took for that purpose. Now imagining it may equally be agreeable to you to know the circumstances of my life, many of which you are yet unacquainted with, and expected a week's uninterrupted leisure at my present country retirement, I sit down to write them for you, to which I have, besides some other inducements, having emerged from the poverty and obscurity in which I was born and bred, and having gone so far through life with a considerable share of felicity, the conducing means I made use of, which, with the blessing of God, so well succeeded, my posterity may like to know, as they may find some of them suitable to their own situations, and therefore fit to be initiated. So, Anne, start writing your memoirs for Caitlin. Don't leave out the juicy stuff. No, that's a terrible thing to say to a mother. So he sits down and he's writing a letter to his son. Well, is there anything more 18th century English than writing an epistle to your kid? The most famous of these are Lord Chesterfield, but so many others are inducements. Here's how I have lived, and here's how you can benefit by my mistakes. Makes perfect sense. And you read this and you think, old Ben Franklin, long hair, in a windstorm, flying a kite. Well, maybe did I put it in? Oh, I didn't. Sorry. Flying a kite with his young son next to him. But really, that's not true at all. I'm sorry, I moved this PowerPoint around just before I sent it to Caitlin an hour ago, so, or maybe less than an hour ago. So there are some. Franklin liked text. His entire life, he liked text. He was a little boy who liked to read. He put everything he had, he literally starved himself to be able to buy loose editions of The Spectator and The Tatler, the famous English text. That would take a long time to explain if you're not familiar with it, but look it up. From a very early age on, we think from the 1720s was the first time he wrote this text, which is allegedly what he wanted carved on the stone that would be over his grave, in which he compared his body to that like a book. The pages had been torn out, but he believed that God would bring him back in a better edition. And for years, he rewrote this. It's in multiple versions in his handwriting, and eventually Christchurch, Philadelphia, where he now lays next to his wife, Debbie, and his daughter, Sally, had it carved on a plaque. Unless, I don't know if the burial ground is back open yet. We're figuring out how to come out of COVID right now. Franklin in 1771, though, is a person of renown and letters when he sits down to write this thing. Unfortunately, there was no photographer available. There were no iPhones at the bishop's house at this time. So the best picture I can give you is the 1773 print of a 1760s image showing Ben Franklin, famous guy. I've repeatedly begged the Franklin House, London, to reinstall this lightning alarm system, which is a grounded lightning wire attached to a bell, attached to another bell, with a clapper ringing in between. And if it gets, but is in the case of the Franklin House, Philadelphia, it took a direct hit and blew the bells apart one day. So really, you shouldn't try this at home. But Franklin has been, by 1771, he is an internationally famous intellectual. His lightning experience, published in London for the first time, you can walk over, I'm going to blank on the name, of the St. John's Gate. Any Londoners on here want to correct me on that? It's now a little museum, but the printing house was upstairs, and they will let you go up and look at it, the room where Franklin was first published on science. But he had received international renown. He had received honorary master's degrees. Eventually, he'd received 2 honorary doctorates. So Franklin is a guy, he's got some game in 1771. He's in England trying to convince the Penn family to pay taxes on their western land to protect the whole colony. And he's a guy who can, get into any doorway. He's well connected. So the idea that he would write an autobiography is not that strange, but his autobiography, frankly, is pretty strange. He is, to just give you an example of one of the doorways open to him, Jonathan Shipley, who had just been appointed a couple of years earlier as the new bishop of St. Asaph. Like most British bishops of the 18th century, you didn't want to live anywhere near where your cathedral was because you wanted to be in the room where it happened. You wanted to be in London. One of the delights I had was a few years ago, one of the porters or butlers or whatever they're called in the House of Lords took me to walk around, and the Lords were meeting, and while there, a Lord Bishop came in dressed exactly like Shipley. He didn't have the periwig on, but it gave me a good chuckle, and the people around me looked at me like I was the crazy American. But Shipley is a guy with political connections, and he's very fond of Americans and their cause. And Franklin is invited to summer for a week with him at their country house, and that's where he begins writing all of this. It's almost like, you're the guest. You get to come in and do your talent, and Franklin's talent was words, and the family enjoyed them. But what about this dear son thing? What about that? Why write to his son? Now, again, I started to allude to this image of, this is how we picture Franklin in the autobiography. And indeed, this Currier and Ives 19th century image is one that would have been held up by, it would have been hung in classrooms that were reading Franklin's autobiography. And here you see a man, certainly in his maturity, maybe going into an older age, with this pubescent son standing next to him, flying the kite in 1752. But of course, had Franklin flown the kite like this, he would have been blown apart by a lightning bolt, or probably had his eardrums exploded at the least. And William was at least, let me do the math here, at least 21, maybe 22 at this time. And I don't think he had any kind of dwarfism. So this is kind of nonsensical. But in fact, William at this point is on the rise. He is, he's become a royal governor of the colony of New Jersey. Anybody here from New Jersey? Would you mind a couple New Jersey jokes? No, that would be in poor taste. I won't do that. But Franklin had used his political and personal fame to get his son a plum government job. And being a royal governor, it might not be the greatest governorship, but he might be able to hope to be able to move to a bigger colony or a better paying position. Or maybe in 1771, William was still hoping that he might end up Sir William Franklin or Lord Franklin, Earl of, I don't know, Delaware. Maybe not. That's maybe a little nonsensical. But of course, like Chesterfield's story, Franklin's story to William has that added hitch. Doesn't ever mention it. Had tried to keep it as gently hidden as possible. But William was the product of a non-marital relationship. And I'm not going to use the word they would have used at the time. It was thrown back in the Franklin family's faces in 1764 to the embarrassment of Mrs. Franklin. Was he really writing to a son who needed guidance to come up in the world? Well, William now had a position in government higher than Benjamin ever did. But of course, the decade that followed was going to change a lot, including their relationship. And our time today is short, so we'll go on. One of the striking features of the beginning of Franklin's autobiography is that he calls to question himself. He uses a term, and I meant to find one in an old edition, but I didn't have time to dig today with everything else going on. But probably if any of you are old book collectors, you have a book with an errata page in it. They often were the size of a postcard, or maybe a little bigger, a document that was printed and tucked inside or glued inside the cover of the book where there were errors. It might be something like, the Stamp Act was not passed in 1751, it was passed in 1765. Or an error like that, a typo. There were, in the first edition of my first book, 2 typographical errors. I still wake up at night sweating over that. But Franklin keeps himself in the persona of a writer, an author, a printer, by including in his own narrative mistakes that he said he made and ways that he later sought to correct them. These range from the very personal, trying to seduce the mistress of a friend, to the familial, he mistreated the woman who became his common-law wife, to, well, we'll move on to that in a moment, but trusting people who didn't earn his trust. Well, who's in the thing? Maybe that gives us a little sense that not everything Franklin says in this memoir is necessarily 100% accurate. For example, let's look at his private life. This is, still to my shock, putatively a portrait of Abiah Franklin, Josiah Franklin's second wife and Benjamin Franklin's mother, the mother of Josiah's second family, and the mistress of a brood of children. But I, as a scholar of portraiture, I've looked at this many times and gone, really? Okay, if you say. It looks very Spanish to me. It looks, it looks very formal in some ways. But the simple fact is, Abiah Folger Franklin was a member of a very prestigious and long-standing Yankee family from near Boston. She comes down from a group of weighty people. As Dr. Julie Fisher has pointed out, her family was essential in Native American foreign policy between English folks and Native Americans. I don't see the poverty here. And frankly, this is the smoking gun. Franklin talks about his poverty and how hard he had to come, but most people didn't have portraits painted, and yet this lady did. She's almost a stock character in the autobiography. And in the few documents that survive where he's writing to her, I learned this weekend, there's only one letter left in her handwriting. But she was not amused by some of the things her son did. And in his carefully scripted letters telling her how he felt, he was trying to, in some ways, reimagine their relationship. The other big personal relationship, I moved a slide there. So let's think about private relationships. In his public life, of course, probably the most famous government servant to appear in the autobiography is the governor, Sir William Keith. So impressed by young Benjamin Franklin that when Franklin had arrived in Philadelphia, he went to the print shop where Franklin was employed, took Franklin aside, took him out for a bottle of Madeira wine at a nearby inn or tavern, and became his great benefactor. Franklin tells the story that, and it is a very long story, and I'm mindful that we need to be done in about a half hour or so. Franklin tells the story that Keith made him a lot of promises, sent him off to London. Poor, suffering Ben Franklin got to London, didn't have any money anymore to live on, and Keith neglected to write the letters of credit, basically giving a 17-year-old stranger his credit card to go purchase printing supplies, etc., in England. I am one of those Franklinists who kind of looks at this and goes, and we'll get on to why in a little bit. What Franklin doesn't say is Keith is in the middle of a political schism, almost a civil war of Quakers versus non-Quakers in early Pennsylvania. And I don't know how many of you know much about Quakerism, particularly of those not in Pennsylvania right now, but this guy is no Quaker. In this grand formal wig, he's wearing breastplate, an ermine cape, the beautiful lace at his throat, all speak to his high elevated status, and he's a baronet. Maybe one of our English participants can exactly explain the ranking of that. I'll have to base all my knowledge of British aristocracy on Downton Abbey. But he is a man of elevated status who is hired by the widow of William Penn to try and keep the tax money flowing in so she can support her young family. He wants to become the elected governor, or maybe even the governor general of Pennsylvania. That never happens. And Keith, by the time Franklin returned to Philadelphia, had fallen from favor and power. Franklin lists him as one of the errata, saying, I should have never trusted him just because, and this made me more leery of anybody who is powerful, and why should I listen to them, or why should I support them? But this is Sir William Keith. Franklin, of course, and I have to admit, I was digging for my own photographs of this era. I have walked every bloody inch that I think Benjamin Franklin, I said bloody in an English program, oops, sorry. But I have walked every inch that I can try to find of Benjamin Franklin's life on this first step, and touched or looked at everything I think that he saw. Of course, he's living in a part of London that was blitzed. Mindful this week is the 80th anniversary of just the horrifying attack on East London. I often think of that one there. But you can go to the only printing house that that Benjamin Franklin printed in that is now a church once again, St. Bartholomew the Great, which is has a wonderful. You can go in and sit in the Lady Chapel where Franklin's printing house was. You could have tea and cake, which of course is the English national pastime. Caitlin, please send cake. I actually went out to celebrate yesterday and bought Jaffa cakes that I'm going to eat in front of you at the end of the. I didn't know you could buy them in America now, but thank heaven for Aldi. And this is a lane Franklin would have walked. The buildings here on the left probably are buildings he knew. Most everything Franklin knew in this area was either blitzed or torn down by Britain's version of urban renewal. And poor Benjamin Franklin, trapped for over a year in the mother country, in what is undeniably the greatest city in the modern world, surrounded by pretty women, witty gentlemen, great pubs, live music, and bookstores. Yeah, I don't really think Franklin suffered a darn moment. I think London actually, in that voyage, more even than the ones in the 50s and 60s, really made Benjamin Franklin. It gave him a glimpse of what the literary world had to offer, what the world of print was about, what it was like to join together, not just to talk about who has to polish the benches in the church and who has to ring the bell on Sunday, but to get together and try and get to become part of an expansive world of ideas. The trip to London will be the birth of the Junto Club and every other club that Benjamin Franklin ever belonged to. And as Dr. Johnson said, he was a clubbable man. Some of you are on Facebook, and we've just started a group called the Benjamin Franklin Junto, trying to resurrect the old Friends of Franklin to hopefully raise some money for good causes, get some scholarship going, and please join us on that for longer talks. The London voyage, the London stay is incredibly important. He met diplomats and booksellers and Catholics. He'd never met one in Boston, certainly. And he learned more about religious diversity and plurality and language and writing. And it was an incredibly important moment. And most books about Franklin just still believe his autobiography. And it was this terrible, terrible mistake. There's, well, I've gone a little bit further into London, but there's the best blurry version I can get of Little Britain in the 18th century. Let me see. I've made an error here in PowerPoint. So mea culpa. This picture is sitting on top of a slide that says the autobiography, who's in it? And somehow I just smushed those two slides together. But, you know, I'm a historian, not an IT person. Who's in it, of course, sometimes he manipulates characters and sometimes he tells them beautifully. In his autobiography, Deborah Reed is, of course, there. She was the pretty young thing standing on the stoop, sweeping or mopping. Philadelphians are always proud of their front stoops. When young Benjamin Franklin walks by at the age of 17 in 1723. They will become friends and begin courting. And he will want to marry her, he says, but then he leaves for London and he develops other interests. Her mother had none of it. And Mrs. Reed started looking for a more prosperous artisan. And of course, by the time Benjamin got back, she had been left in this sort of semi-widow thing where her first husband, it may have been her illegal husband, because rumor began to spread that he was one of many men who, when you have a wife or a husband and you don't necessarily like him, you can't get a divorce, what do? You just go to another colony and hope nobody finds out. There are other instances, including in very prominent families, where years after a second marriage took place, husband number one gets off a ship and says, oh yeah, sorry, I decided to go to India instead or something. Deborah Reed is left in this middle ground because her first husband has disappeared, the potter John Rogers. When they did an archaeological dig on the site of their house, they actually found his archaeological remnants many years back. But Deborah and Benjamin rekindle this, and she's presented first as the wronged woman, And then as the sort of, damaged person, maybe even damaged goods. And then finally he says that she's the one who, he took her to wife. It was a common law marriage, and they strove along for years to come. Deborah's probably one of the most important people in his life. He writes very little about her, but very much to her. Famously, she categorically refused to ever get on a ship with him, so she never lived at the Craven Street house. The friendship that she had with Franklin's landlady there makes us pretty certain that there was not anything romantic going on between Franklin and the landlady, because it would be pretty unusual for the wife and the mistress to be doing shopping for clothes and apples together. But Deborah's a very important character, but one we need to unpack further. And now that her account books are being digitized by the American Philosophical Society, more of her papers are available. Her literacy is very challenging, but it's very important. We can see more, but she's an important character of the book. Of course, Franklin tells the story that I actually, if you listened to me last year on National Public Radio, when I was talking about earlier epidemics, before I guess we had the word pandemic, we talked about Frances Folger Franklin, the child of their new marriage. And they had taken in William Franklin, Benjamin Franklin's son, with another relationship. Frankie was as Franklin explained it now in the autobiography, decades later, the apple of everyone's eye. But Franklin also puts one of the great errata of his life and career. He hesitated in having the baby inoculated for smallpox. The baby caught it. Franklin had been an outspoken person against smallpox while in Boston and still in his brother's printing trade, and the baby died. Frankie, as they called him, is buried near his parents in Christchurch Cemetery. This portrait, my understanding is, still descends down in a member of Sarah Franklin Bache's descendant. I've never seen the original. But Franklin, this is one of the great errata. He understood science. He came to be a very famous scientist, or natural philosopher, as he would have called it. And yet he failed science, and science failed him when his baby son died. But there's a lot of who's nots. There's a lot of empty pages in the autobiography, and the most famous being her. Deborah Franklin, I'm sorry, wrong. Sarah Franklin was almost the afterthought child. She's born a decade after her next brother. She's born in 1743, or for frame of reference, the same year as Thomas Jefferson was. And yet she doesn't appear in one page of the autobiography. Now that's weird. Dead kid gets pages, tears shed on the older half-brother gets the thing written to him, and Sally's absent. Do we have any ideas on why? Anyone want to unmute and jump in?
Did he think she was a spendthrift? I mean, he always was talking to her about watching your money.
You know, Jim, he thought everybody was a spendthrift, but I don't know did you get to see the Franklin Tercentenary exhibit?
No, but I know I've read that he had written to her and said, when she asked for something, and said, you're being too, luxurious.
She asked, Daddy, could you send me a little lace? There's no nuns in Philadelphia to weave lace. There's no Spitalfields, well, those of you in London probably know Spitalfields well. It's very posh now. It didn't used to be. But the weavers of Spitalfields and their beautiful fabrics, the lace makers, he writes and says, send me lace, and he responds, I'd rather send you rags. Why don't you just hang your clothes up, let the moth eats them, and they'll look like lace then. And she's kind of, we had a lot of controversy, did you like how I pronounced that, Caitlin, last year about a gentleman named Hunter Biden serving on a foreign board. But there's always this strange thing with presidents' kids, not including the current administration. They're particularly different. But, presidents' kids, their parent gets into office and suddenly they're dumped upon by, oh, do this, go to this, and what if you don't have the money for it? It can be really challenging. Some presidents' kids have really struggled with this, and some have gone into hiding over it. It's pretty rare in recent years that we have a pretty normal family to come out of high power in America. I don't think Sally was that much of a spendthrift, although she had nice stuff. I think she liked fine things like everyone else did. But she's an incredibly important character in Philadelphia. She makes Benjamin Franklin's later life possible because she's the one who stays home and takes care of her aging, eventually sick and dying mother. But she doesn't get a page in the autobiography. She gets an awful lot of letters. She also, I should point out, if we're going to feel too sorry for her, she inherits the estate. So she and her husband, Richard, who unlike Deborah and Benjamin, went forth and multiplied. There's still a lot of Baches, and I have met a few that look strikingly like Benjamin Franklin, including, I love the picture of his granddaughter, who was a major organizer for the American cause during the American Civil War, and it really looks like Benjamin Franklin in a Victorian wig. Sally's not there. Jumping subject, and I know I'm running a lot longer, but it was a lot of fun stuff I wanted to put in here today. Place is incredibly important in Franklin's autobiography. He gives us detailed, beautiful looks at London that, again, I have walked and sat on stoops and sat in pubs, lots of pubs, all trying to find Benjamin Franklin. The place is important. This is a fragment. Some of you have seen this slide before, but years ago, my late colleague Claudine Lopez found this. It's the back of a receipt for shirts where Franklin is writing the autobiography and calculating the date that he arrived in Philadelphia. You guys see my mouse when I do this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, here he is at the Bay of Fundy. Here's Perth Amboy. Here's the Pines Browns Ferry. He gets to the River Dee, the River Delaware, on Saturday, the 5th of October, and he arrives here on Sunday, the 6th. I always try and go down and walk the path that he walked on October 6th. I guess this year I'll do it in a mask, but place is important. And he gives us an incredible view of Philadelphia in the 1720s in the autobiography in the first part. He breathes life into Peter Cooper's painting. This is at the Library Company of Philadelphia now. It was found rolled up in a box in a London antique shop in the late 19th century. But this wonderful view of this little city along the Delaware River. And he tells us a lot about that city. The story that's in the autobiography that we love to tell is that Franklin, after eating a loaf of bread, drinking some river water, saw crowds walking into this building. There is now a bar on this site, and the rest of it is all gone. But he wandered into the Quaker Meeting House at 2nd and Market Street and sat down and fell sound asleep, and the Quakers let him sleep. They were a gentle people, I always like to say. But he gives us glimpses into the city life. And I always say, this is a print, this is a watercolor by a man named William Breton, who, as the city started industrializing in the 19th century, painted it. I have a few of Breton's prints in my own collection. But if we could all maybe go to Quaker Meeting here. Here's the townhouse, which figures prominently in many of Franklin's early writing. Right over here was the Presbyterian Church. The theology would have been very similar to young Franklin's. And if he'd walked out the gate and turned and walked this way, he would have come to Christ Church, Philadelphia. He might have met Debbie's family, who were devout members of the Church of England. We have Debbie's copy of the Book of Common Prayer. But it is a small, compact little brick town in the English village of Philadelphia in the 1720s. He also, of course, and I'll have to cut this short, he gives us a lot of glimpse into the world of Benjamin Franklin the printer. The Quakers did not emphasize the printed word, as did other groups that broke with Roman Catholicism or from the Church of England, as the case may be. They believed in the inward light and their theology, which could easily fill an hour by better theologians than me. But Franklin found employment and friends and support first in the printing house of Samuel Keimer, who, again, we could go into him in great detail, but Franklin portrays him almost as if kind of a nutcase with his long untrimmed beard and his very strange ways of trying to get his printing business off the ground. Keimer is actually one more religious sectarian in a colony that's full of religious sectarians, so an untrimmed beard in Philadelphia wouldn't have been that different. And also Keimer was grasping at the Enlightenment. Maybe he didn't even know the word yet, but the idea that information and knowledge can spread to more people than just the elite. And the time in Franklin's, Franklin's printing house was tremendously important. I'm sorry, with Keimer's printing house. Keimer will eventually sort of bamboozle Franklin by taking over the magazine idea he'd had, but Franklin will take over and buy Keimer's failed newspaper and turn it into the most important and profitable paper in early America. The Gazette is now available digitally. You can read, you can go in and look for advertisements or for anything ranging from rum to doorknobs to enslaved workers. It will make Franklin incredibly prosperous, as will very soon thereafter his Poor Richard's Almanac. And again, I'm having to paint with a roller here, but he is by the 1730s an incredibly important printer, and getting ahead financially too. It's also the time when he takes Deborah to wife. And then the autobiography sort of turns. It's intimately walking through streets. It's discussing family. It's discussing, oh, then I made this stupid mistake, and if only I wouldn't have done this, then, but if, again, if I could only go back and change it later, I would. And then he starts the Library Company of Philadelphia, and it's, again, the Junto Club, a group of, he kind of hoodwinks the public into saying, it's not Benjamin Franklin who's doing this, it's a whole bunch of us. There wasn't a whole bunch. He donates, I know this seems pretty simple, but he donates all the printed material the library will need. And it will become, it still exists. If you have $200, I don't know what that translates to in pounds right now, but you can buy a share in the, I think I'm still a shareholder. I don't know if I gave my $200 this year. But all this is wonderful and good and fine and dandy. And then, well, it just ends. Did his vacation end? Did his story end? I think, and as I've published in an essay years ago about Franklin and the founding of the Library Company, I think the reason he ends at part one is he writes himself into a cul-de-sac and he can't get out, so he simply picks up the pen on the narrative for 13 years. He is seeing in this that he is emerging from being a private person into a very public person. The library will bring him the number of books, the information, the camaraderie, the club that he's always dreamed of. He'll be able to go and sit and read the latest magazines from London, or scientific treatises from the European continent, or newspapers from other colonial capitals, but it's also made Franklin the private guy, husband, father, son, printer, worker, into a public character. And he couldn't finish telling that story. And he puts the manuscript aside. And he doesn't even really know where most of it is for a decade to come. In 1783, through a grapevine, his London friend Benjamin Vaughan writes to him and says, I've been given this. Wow, what a story. I'm really fascinated. Have you finished it? I want to read the rest of it. What happens after the Library Company? And gives this statement. I have used this over and over again in various places, including it was the title of many of my National Endowment for the Humanities Franklin Teachers Workshop. All that has happened to you is also connected with the detail of the manners and situations of a rising people. And in this respect, I do not think that the writings of Caesar or Tacitus can be more interesting to a true judge of human nature and of society. This is in 1783. And so days later, in a very different situation, he picks up another quill and another sheet of paper, and he starts to write again. The Benjamin Franklin who writes part two is vastly different than the Benjamin Franklin who wrote part one. Part one, he is a subject of King George, living in the mother country, negotiating not just for Pennsylvania, but for other colonies to try and get Parliament to give better support to the colonists. In 1784, he's the citizen of an entirely different country that didn't exist 13 years earlier. He is living in outside Paris in an area called Passy, in the hotel, and I'm not going to attempt the French word right now because I forgot to put it on the slide. Virginiac, anybody want to correct my French? And he doesn't have the manuscript of the original. He just has what Samuel or Benjamin Vaughan has written to him. So he starts to write the text at what he can kind of remember was the stopping point. And instead he gives us a vastly, vastly different story. The Benjamin Franklin who writes the next part of the autobiography is this Benjamin Franklin. Here shown in this is my favorite portrait of Franklin. If any of you see one of these in an antique store, please buy it for me. I can't afford to pay you back, sorry. I do have several versions of it, but this was given by the Annenberg family to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and it's just a favorite image of mine. Very basic, very simple, very coded, very meaning. Franklin was portraying himself as the American of the Enlightenment. This is how he became incredibly popular in pre-revolutionary Paris. And he picks up the story now saying the affairs of the revolution occasioned the interruption. And I'm like, dude, for 13 years, there was no American Revolution yet, but so be it. Franklin goes on to tell a vastly different story. He's living in a vastly different world. Just before they began writing the autobiography, the Boston Massacre had taken place. He will be drawn, he will be, again, continuing to try to petition a king who he loved and respected. But that, as he will say at the end of, or later in his life, it's like trying to hold together a fine, noble china vase, the British Empire. And it failed, and he became a revolutionary. In this news story, he goes on to tell the very public story of his working with Peter Collinson, whose home and Quaker Meeting House were very near Liverpool Street Station, very sadly all blitzed, all gone. Now the street's actually gone. But Collinson had become Franklin's mentor and friend and book agent for the library company. And the story of the library company, instead of just being my friends and I like to read, is very much a public realm, public story now. The story that he writes about is the story that was portrayed in Robert Feake's portrait of a rising man, a public character, who, as he explained, he decided at the age of 42, because that's about the amount of life he can expect, and the Almanac sold well, and the paper is selling well, and his business partners are bringing in good income for the money he's lent him. He decides to retire because he's really fascinated by natural philosophy, and he wants a few years just to focus on it. And this very public man in the second part of the autobiography is the story that Feake is portraying here. He doesn't write terribly much more on this, and then picks it up. Part 3, and I'm having, again, to cut a great deal here, but maybe they'll invite me back next year. Part 3 is, again, much, much more this public character. And one of the public things that he does is to talk about what has been described as the most unusual friendship in early Anglo-American history, the relationship he develops with the great evangelical George Whitefield, in some ways held up as the embodiment of what we call the Great Awakening, of breaking down old barriers and the creation of a more emotional, revelatory religion. If you're in London right now, you can walk to the Museum of London after this. It's not that far a walk, and the streets should be relatively quiet this time of evening. And you can see the plaque of where the Wesley brothers converted to Methodism. You can see plaques in the same area of East London, at that time kind of a poor working area, talking about George Whitefield. When Whitefield arrived in America in 1739, it was like the Beatles arriving in 1964. It was the explosion. And Franklin becomes friends with this fellow, and theologically, they couldn't be more different. But they do become friends, and becoming Whitefield's publisher will actually make Ben and Deborah Franklin a very nice amount of money on publishing his sermons and other accounts. Franklin will use that publicness into what is, for the decades that followed, this incredibly busy time of his life where he's founding things left and right. The building on the left, which was called the New Building, it's where George Whitefield preached. It was created basically as a public nonprofit among people of various religions. They said in their founding text that if leading Muslims were to come to America, they would be allowed to preach in the new building. Eventually, Franklin and co. took it over to create the academy that became what is now the University of Pennsylvania, where I work. So I'm very happy that Franklin founded Penn. But other institutions, like the Pennsylvania Hospital, the fire insurance company, et cetera, all are being created during this time. This is Philadelphia during this period, and you can see some of Franklin's endeavors. The State House, now with its bell tower added, where Franklin worked and helped govern. You can just see it here. The steeple of Christ Church, Philadelphia, that Franklin ran the lottery to help pay for the thing. But you can see Philadelphia is still a pretty small town during this period. Of course, it's during this period that Franklin, and I'm going to have to really cover this very briefly, that Franklin begins his work as a natural philosopher. And his scientific experiments are of critical importance to him and to the world. Let's see what I put in here. This is the Mason Chamberlain painting. And I do love this. And Caitlin, if you want to hang this in the Franklin house, I'm sure Marcia won't get too mad if we burn it down by accident. But Franklin becomes an internationally renowned scientist because of his observations, his experiments, and eventually his discovery of the positive and negative charge of electricity. Here is a viewing note. Are any of you watching the Netflix show Away? No show of hands. No one else watches television. It's about the first human mission to Mars. I can't think of the woman who stars in it. It's very good. But in it, can I ruin part of it? Caitlin, you have to nod with me. Are you a science fiction watcher? In it, they use basic Franklin electrical theory to save the mission about positive and negative charges. I am demanding that I get to play Franklin in season 2. It would make no sense, but they use the idea, and it's all is lost until someone says, we're positively and negatively charged, and they're moving water in outer space that way. It's fascinating. But it's kind of odd to admit, I stopped it, and dear partner had to listen to my long explanation of Franklin's discovery of positive and negative charges and was not really amused. But this is 1750s science that we're still using a long, long time later. He discovered important things. And of course, he gets involved in politics. We don't have enough time to go into this. But his political realm is growing increasingly. Part 3 ends where today's lecture begins. He doesn't write about Mrs. Stevenson or her daughter, but he arrives in London to act as the representative of the Pennsylvania Colonial Assembly and just stops. He just picks up his pen. And again, many days in between going at it one more time. And then there's part 4 with a very deliberate period. By the time he writes this, he has, of course, broken with the British Empire, been embarrassed by Lord Alexander Wedderburn, the King's Solicitor General. And I think a lot of the reason he couldn't really write the London story, the story that we tell at Ben Franklin House, London, 1757 to 1774, 1775 period, is because everything that he did up to a point, everything that he did in that house was destroyed by this moment, when Wedderburn publicly embarrassed him, chastised him, and essentially kicked him out of George III's empire. This is an installation from the Ben Franklin 300 show, for those of you who got to see it, done by the amazing Paige Talbot, who may be on this call, I'm not sure. But this moment, everything he had done for these years stopped making sense. And it's the narrative he never really could write. There are documents, and I don't have time to go into them today, but Carla Mulford has written about that could in some ways be the fifth part, but he never did this. What about part 4? Well, he's working on it literally on his deathbed. And when Thomas Jefferson, shown here in the, and I'm blanking on the artist, forgive me, name, I'll get it when the PowerPoint ends. When Thomas Jefferson is appointed by George Washington to be the first Secretary of State, he stops in Philadelphia on the way to where the nation's capital was at the time, New York. He literally is taken into Franklin's bedroom. Franklin is having a variety of health problems. Sitting up in a chair is very painful by this point. So he's propped up on pillows. The granddaughters are at the foot of the bed doing their lessons while he's grading them. Good to have a little homeschooling going on. And Jefferson is concerned because here he is, this man who's young enough, he's the same age as Franklin's youngest child. And Franklin becomes very agitated because he wants to know what's happened in Paris, what's going on with the French Revolution, what's going to happen next. Jefferson is trying to calm him down and say, sir, lie back. And trying to change subject, Jefferson says, I understand you're writing your memoirs. And Franklin blows it off and says, I'll never finish it now. I waited too long. And Jefferson says, no, we're going to need this. America will need this. Now that we're a nation, we're going to need this manuscript. And Franklin says, no, too late. And Franklin calls over one of the grandchildren, hands him a key. He goes into Franklin's desk, which I believe the one that's now at the University of Pennsylvania Library, hands him a sheaf of papers, and he hands part 4 of the autobiography to Jefferson. It's the part where he's trying to negotiate with the Penn family and doing international diplomacy, where he just stops writing. He gives it to Jefferson, and Jefferson has the only copy of it when Franklin dies, and in fact, the first editions of the autobiography don't have part 4. Again, I made an error here, because this is the point I was going to very dramatically show you the picture of me at the Huntington Library that I forgot to include today. But if you can go on my new website and post nasty messages or something. I don't know. I haven't learned how to turn that part on yet. But Jefferson, let me start this again. Franklin can't get himself out of this story, can't write this. And so he simply stops. Jefferson would eventually give the papers back to William Temple Franklin, who was by then living in London. Eventually, William Temple, Franklin's son's son, the illegitimate son of his illegitimate son, although I don't really like that term, and will have the full autobiography published. But if you read it, and there are various pictures of me with the manuscript that day. One of the ones is, it's very clear that the Franklin grandchildren were maybe a little too active in his bedroom because they spilled the ink pot on the manuscript. And one of the pages that I was trying to study is just a smudge now. But if you look at the last page of the autobiography, Franklin is a printer. Did I mention that? Printers can get into a hell of a lot of trouble if they make a punctuation error in a legal document or anything else. Franklin's periods, his punctuation, is very dramatic. Slam with the pen, swirl underneath it. You know when he's making a period. It's not just a drop of ink. We just painted our living room. I understand drops, that we're still scraping it up now. It's not just a drop of ink. That flourish is missing from the final period. He got himself into the story in the 1750s and he couldn't get himself out. And while he gives us a glimpse of the young Franklin, the older Franklin we have to piece together from other documents. Why don't we, what do I have? Oh, it's a little blurry, but he constantly thought of himself as a man of letters. This portrait is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It shows Franklin as the sage in Paris with the American rattlesnake draped over the frame, the laurel wreath above his head. And sorry, Britons, but Here is the pelt of the English lion, which has been killed, skinned, and draped over the window he's gazing out of. And the French Liberty cap is here. Well, when we're allowed to cross the ocean again, get to the Met and take a look at this. It's very dramatic. But Franklin's portraying himself as a man of 3 letters, of virtue, of virtuous. Why don't I stop the share now, see if anyone's still awake, if anyone wants to turn cameras back on, and are there any questions or discussion? I've talked a great deal longer than I intended to and cut away from your discussion time. Forgive me, it's what happens when you don't get to lecture very much during pandemics.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting.
I see there are chats, but I don't know how to open them.
Yeah, so we actually already have a question. It's actually from Anne Bagamary on the call, who says, is autobiography inherently unreliable because it's so personal, or does that make autobiography more reliable?
Good question. And where are you, in England or here? Oh, Caitlin, where's your mother?
Hi. No, I'm in France.
Oh, oh, cool. Golly, you guys are cosmopolitan. I don't know if is anybody. We have a few Americans on this. We're living in a period of very active memoir writing right now. For example, the current president's niece wrote what has become a very widely selling memoir. Is that available in England yet?
I haven't seen it.
Eleanor, have you bought Mary Trump's book? Oh, I know historians who are reading it like they're reading Lady Chatterley's Lover. You know, reading it under the covers with a flashlight at night. It's not an altogether flattering portrait of her uncle. Mrs. Trump's former best friend, who was paid millions of dollars to be the party planner for the inauguration, has just published a memoir that is a level of vitriol. I mean, nobody ever wrote this book about Bess Truman. I don't know that anybody's ever written a book about Bess. Well, there's one. Our daughter wrote a memoir. But no one wrote tell-alls about Mamie Eisenhower. But I think memoir always has a bias. Memoir, I mean, sometimes it can give us a level, like we know things because of Franklin's autobiography that we would not know anywhere else. We've had people say, well, this actually didn't happen, he made it up. One of the examples was we have almost no record of Deborah's marriage to John Rogers. They found his pottery shop archaeologically. So there are, is it biased? Yeah. But he also, he's telling the story that he wants us to know. I mean, God almighty, I wish he just sat down and described the period from Alexander Wedderburn through the Constitution. Wouldn't we love to know? Wouldn't we, how did he feel? He is, as I think most of us know, and tomorrow is Constitution Day. We should all raise a glass of Madeira to it. If you don't have any, come over. We have lots of Madeira in the house. If you're in France, that's a little harder. But as Eleanor will promise you, I've served strange alcohol at strange times. We wish, and he was very opposed to parts of the Constitution, but he says on September 17th, 1787, in this room at Independence Hall, they were my concerns were born, and in this room they die. I will never tell anyone what I opposed. And he doesn't, only because little James Madison likes to take notes, and keeps adding to them and adding to them. Do we know there are parts of that Franklin really thinks are a bad idea? But he doesn't write that. It's a story, it's a story he couldn't tell. It would have been fascinating if he'd written, if he'd come home in 84, 85 and written the autobiography as if he were going to publish it, because he's obviously going through and making what a printer does. It's and I wish I'd have thought to put a picture in, but you can go on the Huntington Library website and there are visual images of it. He writes it on part of a piece of paper, and then on the other side, he's writing printer's instructions. I don't think I could have been a writer if it was not in the age of the computer, because gosh, that was complicated. More questions. I know I've talked a lot.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, Tim.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, in the autobiography, does Franklin ever discuss slavery in it? And another disturbing, historiographical trend that I've noticed is that historians are describing Franklin as an abolitionist, which is laughable because he owned slaves. And it's bordering
Well,
on
he was
the
both.
that historians
I
could
mean,
call him an abolitionist. But,
you know, I would imagine in time, your great-grandchildren, I don't intend to have any, but go have some kids, and your great-grandchildren will look at pictures of you and say, oh my God, he drove in an internal combustion car when we knew that was causing the climate change, and he kept doing it. Or, I mean, I look around the room that I'm in, which avalanche of books pending, but he was a slave owner. He was a slave merchant. He peddled slaves through his Pennsylvania Gazette. Slaves were everywhere. One of the really disturbing things that David Waldstreicher, my long-term friend, pointed out in his wonderful book about Franklin and slavery, it's a wonderful book, but I don't agree with everything, David, if you're on this there. I said it, was that at one point Franklin is marketing, is advertising the sale of an enslaved woman and her child together or separately in the papers. So it is a woman who, I could show you the physical space of that house. It's not that much larger than my study and its footprint in the dirt. So that means he is breathing the air of this woman and child. He is hearing that child cry. He's hearing that woman sigh as she has to build the fires in the morning. And she's sold because you sell enslaved people when you don't need them anymore. But he does become an abolitionist later. And, it's not in the scope of this, but I do. He goes, he really sticks it out at the end of his life. And by the time he's in London, and I don't know, Samuel, were you on the McNeil Center seminar this week? Any of you? Zara Ennis Hanslin is writing a wonderful new book. It's nowhere near out. She's just starting it, called London Patriots, about pro-American people in London during the Revolution. And one of the things we had the discussion now via Zoom, because we can't meet at the McNeil Center right now, was, what happened to Franklin's enslaved people? Because they just vanish. Eleanor, there's your doctoral dissertation. Get on that. I want to draft by next month. But they just vanish from the page. Julie Flavel, in her very interesting book, When London Was the Capital of America, talks about the fact that most people looked at a Black person in London and thought that is somehow connected to an American. But people of African descent were all over England from the Tudor period onward. I know there's been a controversial book in England, but I have not read it yet, but I understand it's quite good from people who have, about what is called Black Tudors.
Yeah.
I wait and buy my English books when I can get to Hatchard's. So, and I can't come over to either there or Marks and Spencer or to the Ship and Shovel right now. Although M&S, I'm desperately missing, what is the cake we get there? Madeira cake. But, he was an abolitionist who at the end of his life, one of the last things he does is he says to the daughter and son-in-law, you will inherit, it was a vast amount of wealth, but you can't be slave owners. And so they free their slave. And one of the things that Franklin died in April of 1790. The census, the first American census is just afterwards, and I've been trying to figure out if the enslaved worker was still in the house, and I haven't gotten there yet. It's in a new essay that I'm doing for a book on women in the Age of Washington, but I'm trying to, and we simply don't know. But I am appalled by slavery. I have, when I was postdoc at Mount Vernon last year, I would go and sit in the enslaved burial ground, which was unmarked. There are no stones, but the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has erected a beautiful memorial. And I would go sit there and listen to the doves coo in the evening when I was by myself at Mount Vernon. It's very weird to be on that place by yourself at night. Hopefully you don't step on a snake as you go walk through the woods, but slavery was everywhere. Slavery was in every one of the 26 English colonies. Slavery was, a few years ago, Michelle Robinson Obama talked about how she felt about living in a house that was built by slaves, and her opponents went ballistic, saying, no, you can't prove that. And the White House Historical Association literally has the rent books where slave masters were paid rent for their craftsmen to build the White House. Everything, when people said, what if this building was built in part by slave labor? And I said, find me a building in Pennsylvania built before 1780 that wasn't. It was everywhere. And then some people changed. And I don't think you've been on any of my long confessionals, but last year when my cousin started playing with genealogy, I found an ancestor of mine who owned a woman who sued for her freedom in Michigan, of all places. I found an ancestor in Virginia who owned multiple people, and I found an ancestor being buried in 1913 with full Confederate honors. So in my very multiracial family, when my nephews who are African American found out they're eligible to be sons of the Confederacy, they thought I told them they were not permitted to join, as I'm not joining either. But maybe I'm also not a member of the DAR, but that's because I'm a boy. Thank you. That's a very loaded question, but I hope we get, one day we'll actually get to meet in person. Remember when we used to get on airplanes and go places? Anybody? Kathy Siegel, I see you down there. I haven't heard from you. Charlie, maybe Charlie fell asleep. It's Sammy just turned into John Brown. Now that I wish we could hear that story. But.
Well, I'm eating my dinner at the moment. I'm eating dinner, so I don't want anyone to see me eating.
I'm going out for a sandwich soon. I never got breakfast this morning, and I can't live on Jaffa cakes. Well, everyone, I know we're probably at time or beyond. I was told I was hard to find, so I was pressured into and now have a website. I am gwbphd.com. That's also my address at Hotmail, but I'm always happy to dialogue with folks. If you are not a member of the Friends of the Franklin House, I greatly appreciate your supporting it as I try to. It is a wonderful space, a wonderful organization. They've been very kind. They haven't let me spend the night there yet, but maybe next trip over, but probably not. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day, and peace be with thee.
Yes, thank you so much, George, for being one of the first people in our Ben's book club. Yes, do go on our website, www.benjaminfranklinhouse.org, for the rest of our events. And we hope to see you next month for our next edition of Ben's book club. Bye.
Who's the next book?
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, George.
Thank you all.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.